We talk about frontiers all the time on this show, especially Alaskans who tackle some of their own. For Robert Sheldon and his wife Marne, Sheldon Chalet is their passion project, a frontier where the past, present, and future just all come together. Well, Marne, I want to start with you because you married into this dream.
That I did 20 years ago.
What's that like?
It's been an amazing ride. I have married into a family with big dreams and big visions that started many generations ago, and here we are picking all those back up and working hard at it. And the Chalet project has been one of the hardest things I have done in my entire life.
Well, let's kind of go backwards in time a little bit. Tell us about your dad, Don Sheldon, because most Alaskans know who he is. It's a big name, but some of the newcomers don't.
Well, my father ventured north after growing up in Wyoming and northern Colorado at the ripe age of 17, looking for the easier life of mining and trapping and hunting, and claimed that he found it. It, in fact, was easier than farming in those states. But he came up here also out of a sense of adventure. He wanted to make his own way and to begin new things.
Well, there he is, just looking every bit the trapper, but it doesn't look like gold was going to be found there, but elsewhere.
This is such a majestic place that we live in. It's just awe-inspiring being out in the wilderness itself, and you're right, that is its own sort of gold.
So he was in the military, but wasn't a pilot?
That's correct. He was a tail gunner in World War II. He was actually one of the only people to walk away from one bombing run, and so ended up with a new crew to complete his missions. Of course, it was a green crew, and so he ended up staying on all through all their missions too, not just what he was required to do. And that was a little bit of a foreshadowing of why he became legendary. He was willing to risk his life and do things here in Alaska to make sure that others could live theirs.
Well, so this gets to the big question: is how did your family wind up with a chunk of land right in the middle of a national park?
That's right. That's an interesting scenario, but what I also like to share about that is not only did in 1980 did the national park come and join us as neighbors, but we were there not only before then, but before the state was a state. And in the mid-1950s, some of these photographs, my father, who is also a remarkable surveyor, was up there with Bradford Washburn, the cartographer, mapping out the Alaska range.
Because it had never been mapped before.
That's right, and they were putting together good control points in the Nunatak, this land rock outcrop from the glacier, was the control point for Denali and most of that 35 square mile amphitheater area. And so my father claimed that in the mid-50s.
Under the Homestead Act? Is that right, how he got access?
There was a commercial subsection of it that allowed for up to 5-acre pieces that you could operate out of. That way you didn't have to try to farm it or live there full time.
Well, that's amazing because, how would you be able to work that land? I mean, that's a big question, but he must have had some vision to do that. But before we go a little bit further, let's talk about your mother's father, your grandfather. He was also an aviation pioneer, Bob Reeve.
It's a critical part to all of this story, what we're talking about today. My maternal grandfather helped invent skis as they're used on glaciers today, as well as he pioneered glacier landings. There's a book out called Glacier Pilot that talks more about him. And it was through their expert aviation exploits, both my maternal grandfather and my father, that they came into knowing each other, and through that in which my father met my mother.
Let's talk about that, because she comes from this aviation family. It seems like a marriage made in heaven.
Yes, our family's been in aviation since the 1920s, and she grew up in that, had good familiarity with how to run an operation. That's really what my dad needed. But here we see him on their very first date in Talkeetna for an eclipse. Talkeetna happened to be the best place to view it from. And there's my grandmother chaperoning them, because of course back in those days it didn't matter that my mom was coming into her mid-20s. My grandmother was there to chaperone their first date. And my father picked them up there at the railroad. Here they're getting married, and just a year later, and so it was a pretty quick courtship, and they decided to tie the knot. But I want to mention that my father proposed to my mom by saying, "Gosh, could I weld you up a ring Roberta. And that, sure enough, she said yes.
But it was a partnership that was bound together by more things, like a business partnership too.
It truly was. It's really a complicated thing, managing up to a dozen aircraft, which at one point that was kind of the peak before my father passed away. And
So she did that. She ran the
everything, the
business.
scheduling, the operations, the financing, all of that. My father flew up to, and you can't do it these days, but you documented up to 20 hours a day in those summer days. And my mom was literally running everything else. And slowly we hired additional pilots and other staff, but for the most part, it was my mom.
Well, the dream for the family sort of temporarily stopped there, I guess, when your father passed on and your mom didn't want to continue it?
My mom really never got past the death of our father, and she never really seriously dated again. So everything went on hold. And so we had this family lore and these articles and a few other brochures mentioning what my father had pursued up there under the commercial portion of this 5-acre requirement. But everything went on hold when my father passed away.
And this chalet, sort of luxury chalet that they dreamed about, there was a prototype for that. I guess it sort of spawned that dream. Can you talk a little bit about the mountain home that they built there?
Yeah, the mountain house was built in 1966, just
There
a
it
couple of
is.
years after they're married. And
So that arrow points to the actual mountain house, which is so small in comparison to the surroundings. So that's what we're looking at
That's
there.
the scale.
And there it is.
this is a vast area. It's 35 square miles. That rock wall in the background's 5 miles away and about 1.25 miles tall. Everything is just huge out there, but they wanted to make sure, because of the weather and the other considerations out there, that what was built would survive. And so they came up with a 6-sided design, and it survived for over 45 years. You can see some steel posts in the middle there, along with a chimney, but that's echoed in the new structure too, because that prototype and that way of holding up ceiling and making sure stability is there worked out just fine.
So this structure, I understand, is still in use today. It's booked sometimes a year ahead of time.
Yep, that's correct. The bookings are about a year out in advance for this. We also have what I call the mid-market offering of we're adding heli picnics this summer. But yes, it books up quite a bit and is well used.
But there were restrictions that you had to have backcountry experience.
You do. You're trekking in a place. It's an active glacier. It's not for the people that don't have any experience. So we actually vet everyone that comes to the mountain house to make sure that they're capable of getting themselves there safely, unguided, and they know what they're doing, because it's not the place to mess around.
The chalet, though, is a
Very
luxury
different,
experience.
Right. People of any sort can come. They don't have to have backcountry experience at the chalet.
You documented this with some wonderful footage, and I guess, it raises so many questions, like how did you get all those materials to build that?
Well, you're watching some of that right now. The helicopter transported thousands of pounds of steel to get this thing built and make sure it was structurally sound. And so all that had to come in by helicopter. It also came in by fixed wing airplane landing on our staging area there that you see on the glacier. And then if the helicopter didn't bring it in all the way from Talkeetna, it was bringing it from the glacier on up. And there you see the second part of their deck going in there.
That makes me dizzy.
I know, to see that guy standing on there is amazing. But between helicopter and fixed wing airplane, it all came in. No roads, no cars, no trucks. That's how we got it all in.
And that is the other big question, I think, on people's mind is, it took a lot of money to get all of this here. And we're seeing a time lapse of this.
Yeah.
Makes it look easy, but how did you manage this? I mean, there's that complicated relationship with the federal government, the Park Service.
Yeah.
Oh, they have been phenomenal. I mean, as neighbors, we have a good relationship with our neighbor, the National Park Service.
It's not always been that way, but one of my efforts has always been, as Alaskans, we can always figure a way to advance together in a manner that's respecting everyone's needs. But I'll tell you what, the last 4 years of the National Park Service has been a delight. It's not just we can advance together, but there's an alignment of interests here.
Well, let's talk about the cost. Let's go back to
Okay.
that. I mean, can you put a price tag on this?
I sure can, but
Priceless?
so we just saw these priceless views and all of that, and we saw the steel going up. So I'll just give you some reference for the steel. So we have 95,000 pounds of steel that you just saw there, and I'll share with you, we have in excess of $600,000 installed pricing in just the steel.
So multi-million dollars.
It's probably safe to say it's more than $600,000.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that.
Hence the priceless, because you can't do this anywhere else but our property.
You know, project economics are not driving this effort. Alaska has an opportunity for mid and high-end tourism. We're not tapping it. Over 90,000 bed nights a year go unsold because we just don't have it available. But it's important for another reason, not just to capture those bed nights. People with means tend to come in at those two market levels. If we can't even host them, then those people with means can't even become introduced to our friends at the various not-for-profits that are in the park.
But $2,300 a night is a steep tag. I mean, who do you expect to fill these rooms?
So we have inquiries from business owners, which the United States is built on, small business owners, all the way up to a couple sets of royalty have contacted us. And so we're looking forward to meeting people in a way that we can accommodate them there. That's why we still have the Mountain House as in operation also. We have both heli picnics as well as an overnight opportunity there. But it's this entire market together. It creates a symbiotic ecosystem so that, for example, the not-for-profits can meet people with means. This will be a crown jewel for Denali National Park. Each national park nationally has one. We haven't until now.
But I got to go back to one thing because, you know, as you look at this, all these questions pop up in your brain. So, you know, that area, of course, is in an area where there's a fault, earthquakes.
That's right.
And winds, strong storms. I mean, I could just see a wind sweep that off of its perch.
So we were up there December, and winds were howling on this one particular day. And we knew it because you could see it happening outside and snow swirling and whatnot. And you're inside going, that's not much of anything. And you're not feeling the building shake and you're not hearing the winds howl through the building. So it's so sound. And it was quite a cool experience watching all this go on outside, but yet you were safe and warm and comfortable.
And when you
inside.
stepped out into it, there were gusts over 100 miles an hour, so you didn't stay out for long. But what's neat about this whole endeavor is, and why I mentioned that it's not necessarily for the profitability that we did this. This is an experience that people need to see geophysically. It is incredible up there. But part of the geophysics it took us 2 years to put in the right foundation to make sure it was reinforced to the level that it needs to be to withstand these. And you mentioned some of the faults nearby. Fortunately, none run through us. We're insured, if you can believe that, up there. We even had builder's insurance. It's hard to get that if you have a high risk, but I can say that we are built to the maximum seismic capability with our structure, and we took 2 years to do that, and only just this year did we finally go vertical.
So very quickly, what would your parents think of this if they were alive to see it?
I'm sure my dad would jump up and down with joy. My grandfather challenged him to build other adventure tourism places, just like my maternal grandfather had done on the Aleutian chain as part of what his endeavors were. My mom would probably be very surprised. There's original plans that we unearthed a little while after we started our own designs for this, and they were dated 1968. And I'm sure my mom would look at this and say, oh my goodness, this is what we designed back then. So it's wonderful.
And your sons have been involved with it, and we're going to talk with a couple of them when we come back. So up next, the Sheldon brothers join us, how they help lay the foundation for their own future.